An elderly woman, struggling to pay for her medicine with coins. A smug pharmacy employee, humiliating her in front of silent customers. And Big Shaq, watching from the shadows. He doesn't yell, he doesn't threaten. But when he steps forward, the air shifts. What happens next? Let's just say, some lessons are learned the hard way. Stay tuned for a story that will shake you to your core. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning sun bathed the city in gold, stretching across streets lined with towering buildings and neighborhood shops. The air was crisp, alive with the rhythm of a new day, cars honking, footsteps shuffling, baristas shouting out coffee orders. A woman hurriedly crossed the street with a paper bag clutched to her chest, while a street vendor arranged fresh fruit on a wooden cart. Life moved fast here, but for one man, today was just another quiet moment to observe the world he had once only dreamed of being part of. Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq to the world, walked at an unhurried pace, his massive frame making him impossible to ignore. Yet his demeanor so effortless that most people barely registered his presence. He wasn't the type to drape himself in luxury or roll with an entourage. Today, he wore a simple gray hoodie stretched over his broad shoulders, black sweatpants and sneakers that had seen better days. A man of his wealth could have owned a fleet of high-end cars, but instead, he chose to move on foot, to feel the energy of the streets, to remain connected. A small convenience store buzzed with early morning activity as customers lined up for their coffee and newspapers. Shaq stopped outside, leaning against the brick wall, watching. A teenager struggled with an overflowing backpack, papers slipping out as he cursed under his breath. Shaq bent down and gathered the scattered sheets, handing them back with a knowing smile. "Thanks, man," the kid mumbled, stuffing them into his bag. "No problem, young fella," Shaq replied in his deep, comforting voice before watching the boy rush off into the city's current. A few feet away, an old man in a plaid jacket stood near a food truck, patting his pockets with a look of concern. Shaq had seen this scene play out 100 times before. Someone realizing they were short on change, hesitating before stepping away. Before the man could retreat, Shaq strolled over and handed the vendor a bill. "His coffee's on me," he said simply. The old man blinked in surprise, his lined face softening with gratitude. "Well, ain't that something? You didn't have to do that, son." Shaq just shrugged. "Enjoy your coffee, sir." It wasn't about being noticed. It wasn't about the cameras or the headlines. It was about remembering where he came from, about the days when his mother had counted every dime, when kindness from a stranger had meant the difference between hunger and a meal. Money had changed his life, but it hadn't changed him. He turned down a quieter street where the buildings leaned closer together, their facades chipped with time. A barber shop with fogged-up windows hummed with chatter. Across the street, a group of workers in neon vests joked over their morning coffee. It was in these spaces, in these moments, that Shaq felt the most himself, away from the spotlight, just another guy moving through the city's heartbeat. As he passed a small pharmacy, something caught his eye through the glass window, a scene unfolding near the register. An elderly woman, frail and hunched, clutched a handful of coins in her trembling fingers. Across from her, a young employee stood with arms crossed, impatience clear on his face. Shaq slowed his steps, his gaze sharpening. It was a tiny moment, just a fragment of the day. But Shaq had learned that sometimes, the smallest moments carried the heaviest weight. And something about this moment, about the old woman's quiet struggle, the dismissive way the employee looked at her, didn't sit right. So, he stopped walking, and he watched. Inside the small pharmacy, the scent of antiseptic and faint traces of lavender from the shelves filled the air. The overhead lights buzzed softly, casting a sterile glow over the counters stacked with everyday necessities, bandages, vitamins, and cold medicine. A few customers milled about, flipping through greeting cards or waiting for prescriptions. At the front of the store, near the register, an elderly woman stood with a trembling hand reaching into her faded coin purse. She was small, barely reaching the counter, her frame fragile beneath an old brown cardigan that had seen too many winters. Deep lines traced her face, mapping the years she had lived, years that had clearly not been kind. Her thin fingers sifted through a handful of coins, her movements slow but determined. In her other hand, she clutched a small prescription bag, its label crinkled from the pressure of her grip. The young employee behind the counter, a lanky man in his early 20s with slicked back hair and an air of restless boredom, tapped his fingers against the register impatiently. His name tag read Tyler. His expression twisted with mild disgust as he watched the woman fumble with the change, a tired sigh escaping his lips. "Ma'am," he said, his voice louder than necessary. "This is a pharmacy, not a coin exchange. You don't have enough." The woman's eyes flickered with panic as she pushed another small stack of pennies and nickels toward him. "Please, I just need my medicine." Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of quiet desperation. Tyler let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Lady, I don't make the rules. You're short $2.30. Either pay the rest or leave." A few customers turned their heads, sensing the tension. A mother browsing the baby aisle hesitated, glancing toward the scene but quickly turning back. An older man near the cold medicine shelf pretended not to hear. No one stepped forward. No one wanted to get involved. The old woman's hands trembled harder as she dug deeper into her bag, searching, hoping, only to come up empty. A defeated sigh escaped her lips. She stared at the medicine in her hand, her shoulders sinking. This is all I have," she murmured. Tyler exhaled sharply, shaking his head. He crossed his arms, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Look, I don't have time for this. Either you find the money or you put the meds back. There's a line forming." There wasn't. A tense silence filled the space between them. The old woman looked around, as if hoping someone, anyone, would step forward. But no one moved. No one spoke. Tyler, growing more impatient, leaned against the counter, tilting his head toward the door. "Come on, lady. You can't expect a business to just give stuff away. This isn't a charity." The words stung, and Shaq felt it from where he stood outside. His jaw tightened, his hands curled into loose fists. He had seen things like this before, too many times. The casual cruelty of people who thought kindness was a weakness. The way some folks looked at others as if they were less than human. And just like that, he knew he couldn't just be a bystander. He pushed open the glass door, the small chime ringing out. The sound was soft, but his presence was anything but. As he stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. He didn't have to say a word. His towering figure alone commanded attention. But he wasn't here to intimidate. He was here to make things right. Artificial chill from the store's air conditioning brushed against his skin, but the scene before him burned hotter than any summer sun. His eyes locked onto the frail woman at the counter, her fingers trembling over the last few coins she had left. Tyler, the smug employee, stood across from her, arms crossed, his posture oozing indifference. Shaq didn't speak. Not yet. He was a man who had learned the power of observation, the weight of a moment left to unfold. He had seen this kind of scene before, too many times. The silent struggle of those with little, the condescending smirks of those who thought themselves better. It was a story older than time itself. The old woman let out a slow, tired breath. She picked up the few coins still on the counter and hesitated before shoving them back into her purse. I understand," she said softly, her voice cracking. "I'm sorry for wasting your time." Her apology was what finally made Shaq's stomach turn. The employee scoffed. "Yeah, sure. Maybe come back when you actually have enough to pay." The words hit Shaq harder than any trash talk he had ever heard on the court. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, clear as day. "We don't beg, baby. We hold our heads high." He was just a boy when he saw it happen the first time. His mother, standing at a register, carefully counting her last few bills for groceries, while the cashier tapped their nails against the counter, impatient. He remembered the way his mother's face hardened, how she kept her pride even when the cashier let out a loud, exaggerated sigh. "This all you got?" they had asked, voice laced with judgment. That day, he swore he'd never let anyone talk to his mother like that again. And right now, this old woman? She might as well have been his mother. Shaq clenched his jaw and exhaled slowly, forcing the heat inside him to simmer instead of boil. He was used to being the biggest guy in the room, used to people staring, used to the quiet that came when he entered a space. But right now, nobody was looking at him. Everyone was looking at her. A mother browsing the vitamin aisle stole a glance, but quickly turned away. The older man near the cold medicine section rubbed his neck and pretended to be deeply invested in reading a label. Even the cashier at the second register kept his head down, pretending to be busy, stacking receipts. It was that same quiet Shaq had seen before, the kind where people saw injustice, but convinced themselves it wasn't their business. Tyler tapped the register impatiently. "Next customer," he called out, ignoring the woman still standing there. Shaq finally moved, a slow, deliberate step forward. The weight of his presence rippled through the store. But still, he didn't speak. He didn't have to. Tyler noticed him now. His smug expression faltered for just a second as he took in the sheer size of the man standing before him. But arrogance was a stubborn thing, and he forced his confidence back into place. "You need something?" he asked, still dismissive, as if Shaq were just another customer. Shaq tilted his head slightly, his gaze dropping down to the old woman's prescription bag still clutched in her frail hands. It was a quiet moment, but it was about to change everything. Shaq took another step forward, slow and deliberate, closing the space between himself and the counter. The air in the pharmacy seemed to shift, as if the weight of his presence alone had pressed against the walls. The old woman glanced up at him, her tired eyes full of uncertainty, as if unsure whether he was there to help or simply another witness to her humiliation. Tyler, the employee, barely acknowledged him. His fingers drummed against the countertop, his patience thinning. "Look, man, if you're here to check out, use the other register," he said, his voice flat, disinterested. Shaq didn't move. His deep, measured voice cut through the space like a quiet storm. "What's going on here?" Tyler let out an exaggerated sigh, shifting his weight onto one leg. "What's going on is that I got a long line." He gestured behind Shaq, though only one or two people were even remotely paying attention. "And this lady doesn't have enough to pay. I don't make the rules. If she can't afford it, that's not my problem." Shaq's gaze didn't waver. His eyes flickered toward the old woman's hands, still gripping the small prescription bag as if it might disappear. "What's the total?" he asked, his voice calm, steady. Tyler rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed at being questioned. "Does it matter?" "She can't pay." Shaq's expression didn't change. "I didn't ask you that. I asked how much." Tyler's smirk faltered for just a second. There was something in Shaq's tone, not aggressive, not threatening, but heavy, a weight that couldn't be ignored. He glanced at the register screen. $2.30. His voice was clipped, defensive, like he already knew what was coming next. Shaq reached into his pocket, pulled out a neatly folded bill, and placed it on the counter. A crisp 20. "Keep the change," he said. For a moment, there was silence. Customers who had been pretending not to listen now turned their heads slightly, sensing the tension. The old woman's lips parted as if to protest, but no words came. Her face burned with the kind of quiet embarrassment that came from being helped in a moment of helplessness. Tyler stared at the bill like it was an insult. His jaw tightened. Maybe it was his ego, or maybe it was the fact that this entire interaction had turned on him, but instead of just completing the sale, he snorted. "Man, you acting like you're some kind of hero," he muttered under his breath. Shaq's brows lifted slightly, but his expression remained composed. "Excuse me?" Tyler shrugged, his bravado returning. "I mean, come on. This isn't some feel-good movie. She didn't have enough money. That's how life works. You either have it or you don't." He chuckled to himself. "But sure, go ahead. Be the big man. Flash your cash like it makes a difference." Shaq studied him, letting the words settle between them. He wasn't surprised. People like Tyler existed everywhere. People who mistook money for power, who believed that kindness was some kind of performance. He had seen it before, in boardrooms, in locker rooms, in everyday life. But he also knew something Tyler didn't. Money wasn't power. Character was. Shaq turned his head slightly, glancing at the old woman beside him, She was still standing there, frozen, her eyes flickering between the two men. And then, with a gentle motion, he placed a reassuring hand on the counter, close enough to be a presence, but not enough to make her feel small. "This isn't about money," he said, his voice even, unwavering. "It's about respect." Tyler scoffed, but for the first time there was hesitation in his posture. Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. He let the words settle, let the weight of the moment sink in. And in that space, something shifted. The pharmacy, once just another stop in a busy city, had become something else entirely. A moment in time where people had to decide what kind of person they wanted to be. And right now, Shaq wasn't the one on trial. Tyler was. And everyone was watching. For a long moment, no one moved. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead filled the silence. Shaq kept his eyes locked on Tyler, but his posture remained relaxed, unthreatening. He had spent years perfecting this, controlling his presence, knowing when to lean in and when to hold back. Right now, he wasn't here to intimidate. He was here to make a point. "So let me get this straight," Shaq said, his deep voice slow, deliberate. "You're telling me that this lady who just wants to pick up her medication is a problem because she's a couple of dollars short?" Tyler huffed, shifting uncomfortably. He forced a smirk, but the arrogance in it was thinning. "It's not personal. It's just policy." Shaq nodded as if considering that. "Policy," he repeated. He tilted his head slightly. "Tell me something. You ever been short on money before?" Tyler blinked, caught off guard. "What? You ever stood in line somewhere, counted your change, realized you didn't have enough?" Shaq's tone was casual, but there was weight behind it. "Ever had to decide between paying for food or gas, medicine or rent?" Tyler scoffed. "I work here. I make my own money." Shaq let the answer hang for a beat. Then, without looking away, he asked, "And if you lost this job tomorrow?" Tyler's smirk twitched. He shifted on his feet, but said nothing. The old woman beside Shaq lowered her head, gripping her bag tighter, the weight of the conversation pressing on her. She had spent a lifetime avoiding scenes like this, learning how to make herself small, invisible. She had never asked for anyone to stand up for her, especially not someone like Shaquille O'Neal. "I should just go," she murmured, taking a small step back. Shaq turned to her gently, his voice softer now. "Ma'am, you don't have to go anywhere." She hesitated, caught between gratitude and the desire to disappear. Meanwhile, the store had shifted. The atmosphere, once indifferent, now crackled with awareness. People who had been pretending not to listen were now fully invested. A woman in her 30s, dressed in business casual, crossed her arms and gave Tyler a sharp look. "Honestly, this is ridiculous," she muttered. An older man near the greeting cards adjusted his glasses and spoke up. "I've shopped here for years, and I've never seen someone turned away over a couple of bucks. This isn't how you treat people." A mother holding a toddler on her hip frowned. "A little kindness wouldn't kill you," she added, staring at Tyler. For the first time, Tyler looked uncertain. His eyes darted around as more customers began to murmur, shaking their heads. His authority, the false kind he had built on indifference and power over the vulnerable, was slipping fast. Shaq leaned slightly against the counter, keeping his voice even. "See, the problem isn't the $2.30, he said. "The problem is that you looked at her and decided she wasn't worth a little patience, a little dignity." Tyler clenched his jaw. "That's not—" "It is," Shaq interrupted smoothly. "You had a choice. You could have helped her out. You could have handled this quietly. But you didn't." The store was fully silent now. Tyler swallowed hard, suddenly feeling like the smallest person in the room. Shaq glanced at the old woman again, then back at Tyler. "So, tell me, what kind of person are you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. And for the first time, Tyler had no smart remark, no smug reply. Because deep down, he knew the answer. And so did everyone else. Tyler's fingers twitched against the counter, his face burning as the weight of the moment pressed against him. His usual confidence, the smug attitude, the quick comebacks, was failing him. The people in the store, once passive customers, were now watching him like he was something under a microscope. And Shaq? He didn't even have to raise his voice. He had just asked a question. What kind of person are you? It should have been easy to brush off, to roll his eyes and move on. But he couldn't. Because deep down, Tyler knew exactly what kind of person he was. He had spent years believing in a world where people got what they deserved. If you were rich, you had worked for it. If you were struggling, you had failed somewhere along the way. That was what his father had always said. People who can't afford things didn't try hard enough. His dad used to mutter whenever he saw someone holding up a checkout line with food stamps. That's just how life works. Tyler had absorbed that lesson early. He grew up in a house where money was everything, where his father made sure they lived in the best neighborhood they could afford, where his mother never let them shop at discount stores because we're not those people. His father had made it clear. Wealth meant respect. If you didn't have it, you didn't matter. And yet, despite everything, Tyler wasn't wealthy. He worked at a pharmacy, scanning items for people who barely looked at him. His paycheck covered rent, food, and just enough left over for nights out with his friends. He wasn't struggling, but he wasn't winning either, and he hated that. He hated the way people with real money walked in like they owned the world. He hated the way rich customers spoke to him, as if he were furniture. He hated the way his boss barely acknowledged him. He was supposed to be more than this. He had been raised to believe that he was better than this. And then, there was this old woman. To him, she was a reminder of everything he feared. Being powerless, being forgotten, being nothing more than an inconvenience. When she had stepped up to the counter, fumbling with her coins, something inside him had curled up in disgust. It wasn't just impatience. It was frustration. Why do I have to deal with this? She was weak, helpless. And for a moment, making her feel small made him feel bigger. It was an ugly truth, one he would never admit out loud. But now, under Shaq's unshaken stare, he felt that truth squeezing him from the inside. He had thought himself in control of this situation, but somehow, without yelling or threats, Shaq had turned the spotlight onto him. And the worst part? He knew everyone in the store was seeing him for what he was. Not powerful, not important, just cruel. His throat felt tight as he glanced around. The woman near the vitamins, the man near the greeting cards, the mother holding her child. They were all watching him. Not with anger, not even with disgust. Just disappointment, like he had let them all down. The realization was slow but suffocating. He had thought this moment was about some old lady who didn't have enough money, but now it was about him, about the kind of person he had allowed himself to become. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he liked the answer. Shaq exhaled slowly, his gaze still steady on Tyler. The young man's confidence had cracked, his bravado slipping away like sand through fingers. The pharmacy, once just a backdrop of routine transactions and quiet indifference, now felt charged. Every customer, every silent observer waiting to see what would happen next. Shaq could have used this moment to shame him. He could have raised his voice, thrown his weight around, demanded an apology. It would have been easy, but easy wasn't the right choice. He turned his attention back to the old woman, who stood stiffly, her fingers still curled around the prescription bag as if afraid it might be taken away. The wrinkles on her face were deeper now, not just from age, but from a lifetime of moments like this. Moments where she had to justify her own dignity, where she had to endure being made to feel small. Shaq reached into his pocket again, pulled out another bill, and set it gently beside the first. "This isn't just for the medicine," he said, his deep voice calm but firm. "It's for whatever else she needs today." A murmur rippled through the store. The woman near the vitamins stopped pretending to browse, her eyes glistening. The man at the greeting cards folded his arms, nodding slightly, as if approving a lesson well taught. A teenage boy near the snack aisle took out his phone, recording the moment. The old woman hesitated, her lips parting slightly in protest. Shaq held up a hand, not to silence her but to reassure her. "Please," he said gently. "Let me do this." Her eyes watered, and she nodded, pressing a frail hand against her chest. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. The look in her eyes said everything. Then Shaq turned back to Tyler, but there was no anger in his expression, only a quiet kind of disappointment. "You think this is about money," he said. "But it's not. It never was." Tyler swallowed, shifting uncomfortably. He had nothing left to say. Shaq leaned slightly on the counter, his voice lowering just enough to pull everyone in. "When I was a kid, my mom used to take me to the store, and there were times when we didn't have enough. I remember standing in line, watching the cashier look at us like we were wasting their time. I remember the way people behind us would sigh, shift their weight, pretend not to see. But they saw. And I remember how my mom always stood tall, even when she was embarrassed." A pause. Shaq let the moment settle before continuing. "And then one day, someone behind us stepped forward and paid. Just like that. No big speech, no cameras, no attention. And I never forgot that moment. Not because of the money, but because of what it meant. It meant we weren't invisible." The store was silent now. Even the hum of the overhead lights seemed distant. Shaq straightened, his eyes still on Tyler. "You had a choice today. You still do." The weight of those words hung between them. Tyler's face was flushed, his hands clenched at his sides. But something in his expression had shifted. Maybe it wasn't a full realization, not yet, but it was something. Shaq didn't wait for a response. He turned to the cashier at the next register, who had been watching everything unfold. "Can you ring this up for her?" The cashier, an older woman with kind eyes, nodded quickly and stepped in. Within seconds, the transaction was complete, and the old woman clutched her bag a little tighter, not out of fear this time, but relief. As Shaq turned to leave, the customers who had stood silent for so long suddenly found their voices. A woman clapped softly. Someone else murmured, "That's how you treat people." The teenage boy, still recording, whispered, "This is crazy." And just as Shaq reached the door, he heard a quiet voice behind him. "I'm sorry." It was Tyler. The words were barely audible, but they were real. A first step. Shaq didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He just nodded once and walked out into the sun. The ripple effect, 1,400 words. The sun was high in the sky when Shaq walked out of the pharmacy, the door swinging shut behind him. He didn't glance back, didn't wait for applause, didn't look for validation. He had done what felt right. That was enough. But inside, the moment wasn't over. Tyler stood frozen behind the counter, still processing everything. The old woman had already shuffled toward the door, her shoulders a little lighter now, the weight of shame replaced with quiet relief. The customers lingered longer than they needed to, whispering among themselves, some shaking their heads at Tyler before walking out. And then, there was the teenager in the snack aisle, his phone still raised. The video had been recording from the moment Shaq stepped forward, capturing everything. The humiliation, the quiet lesson, the shift in power. Without a word, the kid slipped his phone back into his pocket and left the store. An hour later, the video was online. By sunset, it had millions of views. The internet takes over. The video spread like wildfire. It landed on social media feeds, news pages, and reaction channels. The caption said it all. "Pharmacy employee humiliates elderly woman over $2 until Shaq steps in." The comments flooded in. This is what integrity looks like. Shaq didn't have to say much. His presence alone changed everything. Imagine being this heartless over $2. Hope the guy learned something. Some people recognized the pharmacy immediately. Others called for boycotts. And then, there were those who weren't just mad. They were curious. They wanted to know what happened next. They didn't have to wait long. The owner's return. The next morning, the pharmacy's owner, Mr. Caldwell, a balding man in his 60s, walked into his store and found it different. The energy, the tension, the way his employees avoided eye contact. He hadn't been online last night, but he felt it in the air. Something had happened. Then, his assistant manager pulled him aside and showed him the video. He watched in silence, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Is this real?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer. The assistant manager nodded. "Customers are already talking about it. Some walked in just to say they won't shop here anymore." Mr. Caldwell exhaled sharply. He had run this business for decades. It wasn't a corporate chain. It was his. And now, his store was being dragged through the mud over a scene that should never have happened. His eyes darkened. "Where's Tyler?" Tyler was in the back, sitting in the break room, staring at his phone. He had seen the video. He had read the comments. He had felt the shift from everyday employee to public villain overnight. And now, as his boss stood in front of him, arms crossed, disappointment written all over his face, he knew what was coming. Mr. Caldwell didn't yell. He didn't have to. His voice was calm, clipped. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Tyler swallowed hard. I didn't think it was a big deal." The words felt weak even as he said them. Mr. Caldwell's jaw tightened. "Not a big deal?" He shook his head. "You humiliated an elderly woman over $2 in front of customers. And now my store is all over the internet for the wrong reasons." Tyler looked down, his stomach twisting. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Mr. Caldwell's voice softened slightly, but there was no kindness in it. Just exhaustion. "You think that matters? What you meant?" Tyler had no answer. Mr. Caldwell sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You can't work here anymore." The words hit harder than Tyler expected. He had seen this coming. The second the video went viral, he knew his job was gone. But now that it was real, it felt different. "Sir, please, Mr. Caldwell held up a hand. "I'm not firing you to punish you. I'm firing you because I can't have someone like you representing my store." He exhaled. "You need to take a long, hard look at yourself, son. Because this isn't just about a job. It's about who you are when you think no one is watching." Tyler felt a lump form in his throat. For the first time since the whole thing started, he didn't feel angry. He didn't feel defensive. He just felt ashamed. And as he walked out of the pharmacy, for the first time in his life, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. Tyler stepped out of the pharmacy into the harsh afternoon sun, the weight of his termination pressing down on him like a stone. The street outside, which had always felt familiar, now seemed different, wider, emptier. People walked past him, unaware of the storm inside him, oblivious to the fact that just hours ago his entire world had shifted. He had been fired before, years ago, from a summer job he hadn't cared about. But this was different. Because this time, he wasn't just some guy who lost his job. He was that guy, the one from the video, the one people hated, the one who had turned an old woman's struggle into a spectacle. His phone buzzed in his pocket, messages from friends, some checking in, some mocking, some avoiding him altogether. He couldn't bring himself to look at them, not yet. For the first time in his life, he had to sit with the uncomfortable truth. He had been wrong. Meanwhile, across town, the old woman sat in her small apartment, clutching a cup of tea, staring at the phone on her kitchen table. It hadn't stopped ringing all day. She had never been one for attention. Her life had been quiet, predictable. But now, strangers were reaching out, some offering to help, others simply sending kind words. A local news station had even called, asking for an interview. She didn't know what to do with all of it. All she had wanted was to buy her medicine and go home. She never imagined that her worst moment would be seen by millions. A knock on her door startled her. When she opened it, she found her neighbor, a woman in her 40s holding a small brown bag. "I saw the video," the neighbor said, a little sheepish. I should have helped you that day. I should have said something. I'm sorry." She held out the bag. "I brought you dinner. I figured you might not feel like cooking tonight." The old woman blinked, warmth rising in her chest. She had spent so many years thinking no one noticed her, that she had become just another invisible person in the background of other people's lives. But now it seemed people actually saw her, and that, more than anything, made her heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. As for Shaq, he had already moved on. He didn't stay to watch the fallout, didn't linger to bask in praise. That wasn't why he had stepped in. To him, it had never been about the cameras, the headlines, or the internet's reaction. It was about doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. And as he walked through the city, blending back into the rhythm of everyday life, he knew one thing for certain. He didn't need recognition, because knowing he had made a difference, That was enough. What would you have done in that moment? Would you have spoken up or stayed silent? The smallest actions can leave the biggest impact, just like Shaq proved that day. Now here's a challenge. Go out and be someone's unexpected hero, because you never know who's watching and who needs you to step up.